testing. Let me tee this up a little bit. So we went test optional during COVID because it was difficult to access the SAT and the ACT, as did a number of schools. And we kept it going beyond COVID, in part because we wanted to see what the impact of test optional was on our admissions, on applications and the like, to make the decision about whether we just continue on with test optional, whether we require testing again as we did before COVID, or whether we do something else entirely. I'm going to let, and we had Ben chair a faculty group that examined a lot of data about what we can tell from the SAT and ACTs, what the impact was on our applicants and on our admissions, to inform the conversation. Let me just give you a few highlights and then I'll turn it over to Ben and to Steve. So first, there's been no difference in retention from first year to second year during test optional, which is one measure of how students are doing. It's a crude measure, but no difference at all, really, in terms of how many students are coming back after their first year, including students who haven't turned in tests. The others are, is absolutely the case, and Ben and Steve can explain this better than I can, that there is independent predictive value with standardized tests, above and beyond GPA and other elements that we look to in applications. You can learn more about an applicant if you look at their test scores above and beyond what you would find otherwise. The bump that you get, or the increased predictive value, I'll leave to Ben and Steve. It's not as much as you might think. On the downside, there's no doubt that more students applied to UVA during the test optional period, an extraordinarily large number, and many of them first generation students who, when surveyed, said they either would not have applied if we were requiring tests or might not have applied if we were requiring tests. So one of the trade-offs is a broader applicant pool, including first generation students, and knowing a little bit more about the students themselves. Couple of other things and then I'll stop. We are the only, no school currently, no public college or university in Virginia requires tests. Every other school is test optional, and the only school I know that has a deadline is Virginia Tech, but I think they've said they're going to remain test optional until 2028, but I don't think they've promised to go back to testing. That's just how long their current policy is going to be in place before it's reviewed. Among top public colleges and universities, I don't think any of the public colleges and universities that are ranked in the top 5 require testing. So there is a universe out there where if we went back to requiring testing, we would be different from our peer schools. And the schools that we lose out on when people decide not to come from UVA for in-state students are other Virginia schools. So there would be a bit of a competitive disadvantage. That could be especially true of student athletes who are being recruited, say, at Virginia Tech. That said, my own inclination, but I'm bringing this to you because I'd like to have a conversation and hear your views, is I am not convinced that the increased predictive value is worth requiring SAT or ACT. But I'm also not convinced that we should stay with test optional. So what I am leaning towards is continuing test optional for another year and thinking about whether we can, whether it would be wise to follow a test flexible policy, and maybe a test flexible policy with a cutoff. And let me explain. So test flexible is you need to submit a test score, but you could submit a score beyond the SAT or the ACT. So Yale University allows you to submit an IB score or AP scores as opposed to SAT or ACT. One of the things that Ben and his colleagues found out is that the SOLs, which are a standardized test that students in Virginia are required to take, public school students provides the same predictive value as SATs or ACTs. So the additional information you get in terms of predicting how someone is going to do grade-wise is equal between the SAT and the ACT and the SOLs. The benefit of the SOLs, obviously, is everyone is required to take them. Doesn't cost anything. And it would have the added benefit of us reinforcing the importance of SOLs. So it has a number of attractive features. Whether that could work, whether there are challenges to that, how that would work if obviously SOLs are just given to Virginia students, would it be wise for us to have a test flexible policy where Virginia students could submit SOLs without anything equivalent for out-of-state students? There's just a few things, if we wanted to go that direction, I think worth considering. The other piece about a cut, so if you look at the retention rate across the 2 years, it is not the case that the SAT or ACT would in many instances tell you the difference between someone who's going to succeed or someone who's not. It might tell you the difference between someone who's going to get a 3.3 or a 3.5. What the University of North Carolina does, which gets at the question of making sure you're not, I think this is the intent behind it, you're not admitting students who you're worried just aren't going to make it. They only require standardized test scores for students applicants below a certain GPA. And I think the rationale is if you're below a certain GPA, that creates some concern that you might not succeed. And so for those students, they ask for test scores. That's where I'm currently leaning, but I would really love to hear your views. And why don't I turn it over to Ben and Steve and correct me where I got it wrong and add where I've left some gaps, and then we can open it up. But thanks. Ben and his colleagues have been working on this all fall, and they did an extraordinary amount of work. There are some parts of the research that he can't talk about because of restrictions with respect to IRB that I can't say I understand, but I appreciate. But he can tell you a little bit more about the work that they did. Thanks for being here.